It explicitly says 8 days before the calends. That's December 25th. It says it right there. That's written in 205.
Well, that's a tragically complicated case. It's all a bit dodgy, but the worst part is that the earliest manuscript, right before December 25th is mentioned, there is the word April there. And it makes no sense. And there is a reasonable argument to be made that maybe that's the remnant of the original date, and December 25th was interpolated. But that kind of stuff happens a lot. So I always say the earliest really secure reference that we have are these sermons by presumably Optatus of Miletus, who was a North African bishop. So you might just be pushed back to solar symbolism, cosmological, schematic ideas of Christ's role in the world. There's something appealing to the idea that a solar deity is born at the winter solstice when the days are shortened. The calends are an important piece of the puzzle, actually, when it comes to accounting for some similarities between pre-Christian practices and what we do now, or at least what our ancestors did in the late Middle Ages, early modern period. I think we need to talk about the calends more. I think they might be more important than Saturnalia, actually, when it comes to explaining some of those parallels. Where I think there is a legitimate connection is between the wedding of Cana and the fact that it was put on around that time of the year, cultic practices that relate to Dionysius in various parts of the Hellenistic world. That might even be the origin of that episode in the Gospel of John, chapter 2, right?
Around this time of the year, Saturnalia, Christmas festival season, you probably hear a lot of people on the internet saying a lot of things about this time of the year. On one side of the spectrum, Christmas is a copy of all the pagan religions. However, on the other side of the spectrum is that Christianity is completely pure and undefiled from all paganism. They were celebrating Christmas all the way in the 3rd century. After all, Dr. Nothaft and Dr. Schmidt have published articles about the calculations that were taking place. Therefore, Christmas predates the festival of Sol Invictus on December 25th. Well, what if I told you that might not be true, and it's a lot more nuanced than you think? Tonight, I'm bringing on Dr. Philipp Nothaft himself, one of the leading experts in the field, researcher, University of Oxford, All Souls College, who studies chronology, calendars, and systems of dating, medieval science, and European intellectual history, ancient to modern. This will be a nuanced discussion regarding the calculation theory and the history of religions theory, and get to the bottom of which one of these is true. You are about to attain true gnosis. And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today joining me is Dr. Philipp Nothaft, one of the leading authorities on the subject of the dating of Christmas. This is a hotly debated subject, not just online, but also in scholarship too. I want to start it off by explaining the sort of differences in opinion here. There was an article by, is it Hijmans or Hymans? Is how you pronounce his name?
Hymans, I think.
Hymans.
Is the correct. Yeah, I think
he wrote an
yeah.
article, and he sort of kind of changed the consensus a lot, where he sort of points out that, because I think he's a scholar on Roman religion and the sun god in particular. So when he came out and said, look, there's not a lot of evidence that suggests that there's a feast date for Sol Invictus early on. And not only that, there's almost barely any evidence to suggest that the Christians sort of borrowed the idea of having their own Christmas feast based on Sol Invictus. So that's his core argument there. You can add to that if you want, or whatever you think else is important. Then you came along about 10 years later, I think, something like that, and you wrote an article adding, you cited Hymans in your article. You sort of add to what he said. So not only that, but also I think based on the evidence that there is some calculations being done by Julius Africanus. And I'll let you explain in a second. I just want to say one more thing. Third article that I really think people should check out, all the links are in the description for all three of these, is Schmidt, who also adds to what you and Hyman says. He says not only is Julius Africanus doing calculations, but Hippolytus, despite the one that people are questioning in 205, he did it in 235 this one looks legit. So you have two calculations being done by Christians before 274, the famous date where Aurelian dedicates a temple and then to Sol Invictus. I would like to get your thoughts on this, and if there's anything I've missed, I would like to know if you can steelman the history for religions argument and then explain the calculation theory.
All right. I mean, I think Hymans is actually a pretty good starting point, because in order to understand where Hymans is coming from, you have to go back a couple of centuries, right? When Christmas first ended up in the crosshairs of the Protestant Reformation, the initial idea was that the pagan antecedent to Christmas is Saturnalia, and that a lot of the customs are effectively borrowed from Saturnalia. But in the early 18th century, a scholar named Jablonski comes along and points out there is this feast day of Sol Invictus, of the sun god on the 25th of December, and argues, why shouldn't we assume that that's the actual origin of Christmas? So that became an idea which was then developed further in the 19th century. The thing is that there is not much evidence for the ways in which the Romans worshipped their sun god in written sources. That's one reason it took so long for this idea to even take hold. Of course, nowadays we have a lot of iconographic evidence. We have archaeological sources. We have inscriptions that have been collected over the centuries, and that gives us a much fuller picture of the day-to-day Roman religion, and the different gods they worshipped, and so on, and the temples they had, and the feasts they had. And so we know more about the sun god than we used to. But in the 19th century, they kind of ran with this idea that in the 3rd to 4th century, the sun god becomes sort of syncretized with other deities and becomes increasingly important, to the point where there's like this Sol Invictus maximalism all going on. And that has been connected with the Emperor Aurelian dedicating a new temple to Sol Invictus in 274. And it's been claimed that he introduced that feast on December 25th. And then that claim was expanded to say, well, look, this was such an important feast that the church somehow felt the need to react to it and create Christmas as a kind of counterpoint to it. And what Hymans has been doing, he's pushed back against a couple of things, including the idea that what Aurelian did was to introduce a solar cult from the East. The idea was there used to be an old-fashioned sort of indigenous soul in Roman religion, which had been worshipped for many centuries. But there was also a solar religion in the East, in Syria, and the idea is that the old soul was sort of merged or fused with this Eastern, much more...
Elagabalus.
Yes, exactly. So a previous Roman emperor, Elagabalus, actually tried to introduce a Syrian sun god, and was even named after it. And so Aurelian, the assumption was made in the 19th century by scholars such as Hermann Usener that Aurelian actually reinstated that Syrian component of solar worship. And Hymans pushes back against that by just looking at lots of coins and depictions of Sol. And he argues, well, Sol actually always stayed the same. It became a bit more important in the 4th century, but overall, there's never been this change. It's highly unlikely that the Aurelian version of Sol had anything to do with Elagabalus's version of Sol, as it were. And he argues that it's not even obvious that Aurelian actually instituted a feast on December 25th. He introduced so-called games, ludi in Latin, which involve lots of chariot racing, but Hymans argues that happened in October, not in December. And so December 25th as the feast day of Sol Invictus is even later than people traditionally assumed. He views that as an innovation of the 4th century. And because it's so late in relation to everything else, he argues it's even possible that it was a reaction to Christmas. Now, that is in itself also controversial. It depends on how you read a small number of sources, because the sources we have are pretty paltry, right? We have this chronograph of 354, which is essentially a calendar which records the feast day of Sol Invictus for the first time on December 25th. We have a hymn composed by the Emperor Julian in the 360s. And Julian is, of course, famously the one Roman emperor who tried to bring back essentially sort of Hellenistic paganism mixed in with Neoplatonism, right? He was Julian the Apostate for that reason. And so he wrote a hymn to Helios, the sun god, where he attests to the fact that there is a feast on December 25th. And then we have a couple of inscriptions. And if you put these sources together, it's possible that Heymans is right, but it's also possible that Aurelian actually did introduce that December 25th feast.
I've personally spoken to Roman religion experts that think he's right about a lot, but that he's wrong about that particular thing. They think a lot of people seem to think that just the fact that he set up this temple on December 25th indicates that they started the feast right at that time. But
Yeah.
Heymans is right that we just don't know for sure. Like you said, he can be right about that.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. This is controversial. I'm not sure he has many followers when it comes to his most sort of bold statement about the late introduction of December 25th as a sole feast. It's perfectly possible that December 25th was the date of the dedication of the temple, and that's why there was a feast on that date. Still, even if that's the case, which is probably still the mainstream opinion, that means we have to start in 274. We cannot infinitely project this feast back into the distant past.
I agree with that. But it also, at the same time, I also think the fact that Aurelian is dedicating this temple on that day, I don't think it was done ex nihilo. Like I think at least that decade there should be some sort of trend going towards the solstice, or the solstice that they have listed on the Roman calendar at least. But yeah, but at the same time, I think that you're absolutely correct that we can't just go, oh, it's happened on this day, so that means that Mithras and back in 105 was born on December 20. Like we can't do that. We only know what the evidence tells us. The way the evidence falls down on us, 274 is the date that we get for any explicit mention of anything being related to December 25th for any god.
Yes, and as you of course say, obviously the winter solstice is part of the background that leads to this date being chosen, and there's a general trend towards cosmological symbolism and imagery in the 3rd century, which becomes just more noticeable in the sources, and more attention is paid to astrological connotations and so on.
Yeah. Now, that brings us to the other side of the coin, the Christmas thing, because I think you can also say the same thing about Christmas. Even though there's indications that there are calculations happening, don't you think it's fair to say that we don't have any explicit mentions of a festival of Christmas until later?
Yes. No, you have to be very careful. Again, the chronograph of 354 is a difficult source because the manuscripts are extremely late. There's always this danger of interpolation. Some of the dating issues are not very obvious. So I always say the earliest really secure reference that we have are these sermons by presumably Optatus of Miletus, who was a North African bishop. So that takes us to the early 360s, around the same time when Julian the Apostate talks about the 25th of December being a feast for Helios, the sun god. We have the earliest secure reference to Christmas. But
so they're kind of tied. They're kind of tied with the evidence.
It's a bit of a tie. I mean, the argument has been going back and forth. Some scholars have used references in Augustine about the Donatists, who were a Christian sect in North Africa, to argue it must go back to the beginning, at least, of the 4th century. The chronograph has been used to date the emergence of Christmas to before 336. That's all possible, but if you want something solid, you probably have to move it to the middle of the 4th century, maybe even the 360s.
That brings us to, because okay, this is what I think. This is the biggest misconception. Is on one side you have this sort of nonsensical thing where all the gods are born on December 25th. And they all are born in a manger, and they all were crucified. And there's this sort of like kind of nonsensical internet. If I only get it on the internet, there's no scholarship is saying this at all. And but then there's sort of a pushback against that, where people can get sloppy and go, no, Christians were celebrating the Christmas in the 3rd century, early 3rd century. I've even heard a biblical scholar, a well-trained biblical scholar recently, say that as early as 205, the Christians were celebrating Christmas.
Yeah,
It's
the
like,
mistake, yeah, exactly. The mistake that people are making is they don't distinguish between the feast and the idea that a particular date might count as the birthday of Christ. There is chronological speculation, evidently, early on. Even Clement of Alexandria in the late second century tells us about different theories as to when Christ was conceived and born and baptized and so on. That's all well and good, but when we talk about Christmas, we talk about an event in the ecclesiastical calendar, and as far as we can tell, that is not earlier than the fourth century.
yeah, an origin kind of indicates that in 245 at least, he's writing about how birthdays are we don't do birthdays. I'm summing up what he said. And that kind
Yeah,
of indicates that in the middle of the 3rd century, Christmas wasn't a thing yet.
yeah, I certainly agree with that.
Well, so there's probably somebody watching this right now who's losing it, saying, "What about the commentary on Daniel? That's
Hmm.
it explicitly says 8 days before the Kalends. That's December 25th. It says it right there. That's written in 205. What would you say to that?"
Well, that's a tragically complicated case because it's a very early source. I think it's practically the earliest Christian biblical commentary that we still have. And the date is not particularly obvious, but the first decade of the 3rd century is a good guess for when it was written. And the earliest manuscript we have is from the 10th century. It's a Greek text, obviously. And then we have a couple of other manuscripts that are later. And most of them have that December 25th date in them. But there are chronological contradictions between the way the text describes the birth of Jesus and his death and the way they relate to each other in terms of the number of years that Jesus lived, and the day of the week doesn't particularly match, and so on. It's all a bit dodgy, but the worst part is that the earliest manuscript, right before December 25th is mentioned, there is the word April there, and it makes no sense. And there is a reasonable argument to be made that maybe that's the remnant of the original date, and December 25th was interpolated. It's not a certainty, but that kind of stuff happens a lot. If you're used to reading ancient and medieval manuscripts, and if you're used to comparing different copies, what you notice is that calendrical dates and numbers are very sensitive to corruption, because scribes, they don't necessarily mess with the text per se, but they see a number that they think is wrong and they change it. Or maybe they write something in the margin saying, I think it should be December 25th. And then a later copyist in the next stage of the sort of transmission process puts that date into the main text. This can happen so easily that you can't take this at face value, unfortunately, because at one point, December 25th becomes so canonical that there's a tendency to just put it in other texts that are much earlier before this became an established tradition. And essentially, scribes are trying to correct what they perceive to be the wrong date.
That makes a lot of sense. And especially, I was reading Roger Pierce's description of why he thinks it's a later interpolation. No, the lack of citations of it by anyone before, I think he said 10th century or something. But if Hippolytus really wrote that in the commentary on Daniel, you would think people would be citing it, but it doesn't seem to be cited by people. Also, a thing I've noticed, because Hippolytus is the other he also does calculate Christmas, arguably later in his life. He also says April 2nd in a different text. I think it's the
Yeah.
Chronicon. He says April 2nd, but then he does a calculation in the tables that he has. That's what pointed out by Schmidt. But why would he be calculating Christmas if he already knew back in 205 that it was December 25th? It kind of doesn't
Yes,
make any sense.
that's a decent point. I mean, obviously, you could always argue he changed his mind a couple of times in the course of his career. The other thing is, of course, there is a non-zero chance, or maybe even a slightly better chance, that the commentary is not by the same author as the canon and the chronicle. Right? There's this big Hippolytus problem, which has been vexing scholars for the past 200 years almost. There are lots of texts that are attributed to some Hippolytus. They can't all be by the same person, but a lot of them can be products of the same community. There is this very nice and neat theory that Hippolytus is not so much one guy, it's more a Christian community that existed outside of Rome, where people wrote in Greek and they were sort of hashing stuff out together, including biblical commentaries and what have you. And so that it's more like a Hippolytus school of thought, maybe. Our most interesting sort of remnant from that community is this statue, right? That we definitely have to talk about, which is a great source because it's epigraphically and archaeologically, from an epigraphic and archaeological nature. It's not a text that you can just interpolate into. You have an inscription, and that inscription is genuinely old, and that preserves the results of one of those chronological calculations where somebody used an Easter table or a table of Passover full moons and try to figure out in which year of this cycle did Jesus die, in which year was he conceived or born. And that takes us to the 220s pretty clearly. And because there's a list of texts at the back of this statue, some of which can be linked to Hippolytus, it's reasonable to think this inscription has something to do with this Hippolytus community. Again, this is all very, very difficult stuff.
Yeah, a lot of this is very messy. Like it does. I'm convinced by your argument and Schmidt's argument that there was calculations being done before 274, but it also, from you explaining this in your articles, that it's based on a lot of things we have to do, steps we have to take to get there. It's not just like here we found a text, it says December 25th on it. We have to apply the gestation period. Let's do that. Let's start with the Hippolytus statue that you're talking about. What is written on there, and how do we get December 25th from it?
Right. So I don't think you can get December 25th from the statue itself. But the statue has a table of Passover full moons on one side, which is, I have to point out, the statue is essentially a seated figure on a throne. And the only part of the statue that's definitely genuinely early 3rd century is the throne itself. And there is a good chance that the person that was seated on the throne was originally a female figure. And there's a big discussion as to who that woman might have been or what she might have symbolized. Eventually, when it was sort of rediscovered in the 16th century, they turned it into a statue of Bishop Hippolytus, so it's a bearded man now. Long story short, you have two sides of the throne, and on one side you have the Passover full moons for a 112-year cycle starting in 222 that year, which is the first year of the reign of Alexander Severus. And on the other side, you have the corresponding Easter dates. So you just have a list of, in this year, Easter falls on that date, and so on. These are dates in April and March, obviously. But the Passover full moon table has annotations where for certain years in this 112-year tableau, you have references to biblical Passovers, like the Passover of the Exodus and the Passover of Christ's Genesis, which can mean either conception or birth. I think conception is a bit more likely, and the Passover of his death. And the Passover of his death is a date that became extremely influential going forward, and it's quite possible that the person who annotated this cycle or this table started it all, came up with this insight by just calculating back towards a year in which Passover fell on a Friday, because that's what's mentioned in the Bible, of course, in relation to the New Testament, in relation to Jesus' death, right? So they were looking for a year that's somewhere close to when Jesus should have lived. They, of course, know the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius is when he was baptized. And so the crucifixion should have happened within a few years of that year. And then they know Passover fell on a Friday, and they can look that up in the table, and they find, oh, look, in 29 AD, Passover fell on a Friday, and it was the 25th of March. And that's just a very neat finding, because the 25th of March is also the date of the vernal equinox, and it's a date that many Christian writers already in this period associate with the creation of the world. So you have this very neat sort of cosmological parallelism, right? In one neat package, you have the date of the death of the Savior, the creation of the world, and why not also put the beginning of his life on Earth in there?
Yeah, and you also have John the Baptist on the summer solstice.
Yes, so that's an interesting one. We can talk about that later, but that's an interesting. That's part of that whole thought process.
You can see there
exactly.
Yeah, and that's what I think that the truly nuanced position that's not trying to we're just kind of debunk the mythicist or the mythicist is both is whether, first of all, I want to say this. I think you'll agree with me on this. There is no religion called paganism. It's not a thing.
Yes,
There's just different cults of different gods in different cities, And then there's the Roman imperial cult that sort of takes all these cults and sort of unifies them as this tradition. And so you can sort of say the Roman imperial cult is paganism. We can sort of define our terms that way. But whether you're not going to get a tradition about the solstices in any particular as like some sort of religion that had that, especially paganism. What you're going to find um, that in the 3rd century it became sort of a cultural thing about the importance of cosmic solstices and equinoxes being tied to different gods. So I think they're both doing it at the same time, not necessarily one copying the other.
Yeah, and Christians are kind of early in this game. There are early on depictions of Jesus as a kind of solar deity, right, with sort of solar attributes, and references to Jesus as the Son of Righteousness. This happens already in the 3rd century, like you said, and it's part of a whole, you know, way of looking at the world, essentially.
Yeah, there's also an article about the Veruna Mithraist dedicating three different three different Mithraeums. This article is by R. Beck from 1998. Okay, and it's on JSTOR. I linked it in the description, where he's explaining that in 184 and then around like 200 and then sometime in the middle of the 3rd century, there's 3 different Mithraeums that are being dedicated on or one day within June 25th. So that sort of indicates that solstices, not just the winter solstice, but solstices altogether, were kind of important for Mithraists. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that is what I gather from the literature, that I think the summer solstice is important to Mithraism. Yes, I mean, I think that's the latest sort of state of play. I'm not an expert in that field, but I agree with you.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
then so basically when I'm seeing the Aurelian thing happening, and then in the chronography text of 354, it doesn't actually say Sol Invictus. It says Invictus, right? I think it says what is the exact? Do you remember the exact Latin what it says or no?
Well, it says Natalis Invicti, so the birth or dedication day of Invictus, and then the other information is 30 chariot races, which
Right.
is all of this is a bit weird because all the other feast days that are mentioned in the chronograph calendar, the name of this deity is clearly given. They don't
Right.
just use an epithet. And the other thing is the chariot races are always multiples of 12, right? I mean, the Romans had a duodecimal system, and they like to do multiples of 12. And that's the only entry where you have 30, which is not a multiple of 12. Like, what the heck? And the other big soul festival in the calendar, which is on the 19th to 22nd of October, that's where they have 36, which is the highest number you get in this calendar. That's a multiple of 12. So this is all very strange. And since it's our earliest proper mention, it's hard to know what to do with it. There's a possibility there's some level of corruption or even interpolation here, because it's important to point out that we know that this calendar was made in 354, but the earliest copies that we have are essentially 16th century. I mean, there are a couple of fragments that are earlier, but it's just a very, very complicated state of transmission.
So you think that even the parts about Sol Invictus could have been sort of rewritten in a sense?
Yeah, maybe the word soul dropped out, right? That's one possibility. Maybe because somebody thought, hey, this is supposed to be about Jesus, not about soul, so let's remove the word soul, because Jesus is also Invictus, right? There is in fact
Right.
one text that makes that case, right?
That's what I was going to ask you, because I was going to
Yeah,
say this could indicate if this was authentic. Let's just assume it is.
yeah,
This
yeah.
could indicate it's not necessarily soul, but it could be some sort of godhead, either even the Christian godhead or this Roman imperial cult Julian godhead that you get in the 4th century, which is
Mm,
sort of a mixture of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, Mithras, and Soul, sort of like coming together as this godhead. Or and who highlights this even greater is Macrobius, Saturnalia, where he's like,
right.
oh, Dionysus, Apollo, Pan, all these gods, they're all the same. They're all one. And he goes, his name is Yao, Iota, Alpha, Omega.
Mm,
And if you know the mysteries, you would know this is the supreme God. And by the way, they depict him as a child at the winter solstice. So he doesn't say he was born at the winter solstice, but he says he's depicted as a newborn child at the winter solstice. So that tells me, even though
Yeah.
Macrobius is late, it tells me that there was some sort of trend of some sort of godhead being born at the winter solstice.
Yeah, I mean, there's something going on in the background. Unfortunately, often these Greco-Roman sources, right, they're not always so in touch with these cults, and there's a lot of syncretism going on that sometimes, hides a bit what's going on in the plumbing. I mean, a good example is Plutarch, right? Plutarch, in his treatise on Isis and Osiris, also mentions the idea that the Horus child is brought into the world
At the
at the
winter
winter solstice. Yeah, and that's a tricky one because there is some archaeological and epigraphic evidence for the kind of calendrical cycle that was observed in relation to Isis, Osiris, and Horus. There's a recent article by a scholar named Julia Priskin, which came out a couple of years ago, which deals with these zodiacal mosaics and representations at the cultic site in Dendera in Upper Egypt, which is roughly from the middle of the first century BC. And she argues, and this is not my wheelhouse, so I just have to report what she argues. I can't really judge it, but she argues that Plutarch was probably talking about the same kind of calendrical cycle in terms of when was Horus conceived and when did Osiris die and so on. So
Absolutely.
he's kind of locked in with what these people in Upper Egypt worshipped. However, he gets certain things wrong, partly because of language barriers. And the one thing, according to her, that he gets wrong is the winter solstice birth. According to her, he kind of mistakes another moment in the gestation period for the birth, because according to her, and that seems to be a pretty solid argument, Horus was imagined to be conceived in around the autumn equinox and then born around the spring equinox. Again, I don't have much expertise in
I
this area.
I would agree with her. Obviously, that's her real. If that's her, it does seem like there's a lot of confusion with Plutarch, and also Plutarch also does say they celebrate his birth at the spring. So he
Yeah.
basically says, yeah, he was born around the winter solstice, premature, and that's an interesting thing because there's a tradition from Diodorus about Osiris being born premature after 7 months, and Diodorus says because this happened, they thought he was the son of Zeus, and they say he's born from Semele, which is like, wait, Osiris is born of Semele, not Dionysus. Interesting. And then also, so then this premature birth thing, Dionysus is born and has to get put back in the thigh of Zeus. So the premature, I think Plutarch is imposing his own Greek stuff onto the Egyptian stuff. I think that's what's going on there. So even if he's wrong, I still think Plutarch could have been wrong and influential to later people reading Plutarch.
Yes, that makes sense. But actually, I have to say, at least it's good to know that Plutarch had a few things to say that actually match up with the archaeological record, because there's sometimes a tendency to not take anything these Greco-Roman authors take anything they say seriously, because they're sometimes a bit distant from the various religious practices they describe. But a lot of what he says can actually be matched up with these zodiacal diagrams, which is cool, I think.
Yeah. By the way, anyone who hasn't read that text on Isis and Osiris, if you're a fan of religion, that's one of the that you got to read that one. There's just so much in there. But that brings me to the Epiphanius passage. We're jumping around, but it's related. Epiphanius, when he's talking about January 6th, I know this is not the same as December 25th, but he talks about this birth of Ion. Do you know anything about this? It's a very weird passage. What are your thoughts on this?
It is a very weird passage. I guess the weirdest part is that he then parallelizes that feast with others that go on elsewhere in Arabia and so on, and you really wonder how much does he actually know. Um, I don't really know about Ion. This is a bit outside of my wheelhouse. Where I think there is a legitimate connection is between the wedding of Cana and the fact that it was put on that it was put together with Epiphany, and the fact that you have around that time of the year cultic practices that relate to Dionysius in various parts of the Hellenistic world. That might even be the origin of that episode in the Gospel of John, chapter 2, right?
Right. Yeah. Well,
I
there's
think you know what I'm
a
referring.
lot of
Yeah.
primary sources that suggest that. Well, only one of them gives a date, though. Pliny. So I wish those other
Yes,
five
funny.
sources that we have. I wish they could have told us when these things are happening. They don't, unfortunately. But Pliny, in around the 70s, sometime in the 70s, says that on the nones of January, January 5th, there is this Theodosia festival where there is a magical miracle where the water the stream from the water is turned into wine, or is wine that day. And then so then the epiphany happening on January 6th is where people like myself and you just pointed out, is there something going on there? Also, on top of that, Dennis MacDonald's work has been pointing out that John's gospel in particular seems to be mimicking or riffing off of Dionysian stuff. It's intended for the Greco-Roman audience who are into that kind of stuff. So I think there's something. I think there's a good case to be made about the wedding at Cana tradition.
Yeah, I'm not even sure that's controversial anymore, actually.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's, and it's not that, and I think the controversial aspects of it, like when people take it too far and say that they're secretly worshiping Dionysus, or they're
Yeah,
no, they're not even copying or plagiarizing. It's just, this is just how culture is. Things change, people
exactly.
adopt things, they change it. I just think, but yeah, I think that's pretty safe to say. Epiphanius, they call this Saturnalia and Cacelia, and it's like, wait, are you talking about the solstice now, or are you talking about January 6th? So that indicates he is saying he is a little off on something, because this Saturnalia doesn't go on until January 6th. But you do have maybe he's confusing it with the Calends festival, which I think goes on to the 3rd, right?
At least to the 3rd, yes. I think that I mean, the Calends, they have a very long history, and I think later on you find at least one source where it goes on until the 4th or the 5th. I would have to look it up. The Calends are an important piece of the puzzle, actually, when it comes to accounting for some similarities between pre-Christian practices and what we do now, or at least what our ancestors did in the late Middle Ages, early modern period. I think we need to talk about the Calends more. I think they
Yeah,
might be more important than Saturnalia, actually, when it comes to explaining some of those parallels.
yeah, because it's another gift giving tradition, another merrymaking, close down the businesses, decorating everything, lighting up candles, all the stuff that you talk about with Saturnalia also is applied to this Calends festival. And I think what that tells me, and I've been saying this for a while now, and I think I've heard scholars, Roman scholars, talk about this too. I think Mary Beard was talk about this in her book Religions of Rome, that it sort of indicates that the December season itself always has been this way. And it doesn't necessarily mean like Christians in 1500s were going, huh, let's copy Saturnalia. It just means December was always like this and it never changed.
Yeah, there's something to this. The Calends, they really take off and basically overtake Saturnalia around 400, or at least start to gain that status. In 389, I think it is, that Theodosius, who's of course the same emperor who makes Christianity the Roman state religion, he enshrines into law that the 1st of January, the Calends, is now a public holiday. And you can see very quickly how in the 5th and 6th century, the Calends are often mentioned in sources, and how Christian theologians, clergymen are very unhappy about the Calends for being sort of a piece of popular culture that's not particularly Christian, but extremely widely practiced, including by Christians. And it seems to me, and to other scholars, in fact, that the Calends really take off in this period because they are not secular, but not particularly tied to any uh, deity worship. They have some of the same trappings as Saturnalia. They also have this sort of social hierarchy inversion element to it. It's a day or a period where slaves might have a day off, where people dress up, cross-dress, wear animal masks. That's what's often mentioned in late antique, early medieval sources. Where you might be allowed to criticize or ridicule authority. Right? These are all aspects of the Calends that are mentioned in sources, but it's not overtly about sacrificing to or worshipping any particular god. And there's sort of a general sense that the Calends were the one feast that everybody could agree on and could partake in, because it was not that overtly either Christian or anything else. And it's, of course, only really after Christianity takes over as the state religion that the Calends really come into view as far as our sources are concerned. But that's probably what made it possible for the calends to stick around for centuries and centuries and centuries, while all the other Roman feasts disappear from the scene. The calends are still practiced as far as we know in the Byzantine Empire in the 12th century. We still have evidence of the calends being an occasion of joy and carnivalesque revelries in Latin Europe in the 12th century. They go
Yep.
on for a very long time, and it's quite plausible that stuff like Lord of Misrule and the Feast of Fools were more influenced by the calends actually than by Saturnalia.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And I actually emailed this before. I was showing you. I wanted to get your thoughts on the. Well, this is sort of because yeah, the calends continues. Saturnalia goes away, but the calends has some of the same traditions that you see in
Yeah,
Saturnalia. So that
it's
makes a lot
kind of
more
a
sense.
transfer, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Now, as far
So
as
to me,
why,
the calends, yeah,
yeah,
sorry,
I
to me, the
agree.
calends are like the middleman between Saturnalia and the festive season to a certain
Yeah, it's like a,
extent.
a transitional fossil, if you will.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
there, I wanted to get your thoughts on because I hear this a lot too. That when people try to push back on Saturnalia having any influence over like Lord of Misrule, for example. By the way, anyone who doesn't understand this, let me just explain this real quick. Lord of Misrule is a tradition. It's in England or France.
I mean, under the name Lord of Misrule, it's really only attested in England, and I'm
England,
not
yeah.
sure when. I know it appears in 16th century sources, maybe earlier, but there are lots of variants of it all over northern France and England, and I think also other parts of the Latin speaking world.
Right. And basically, it's this thing where there's somebody who's from the lower echelons of society that is chosen to be the like mock king of the day or week or whatever. Well, the
Yeah.
reason why people think this comes from Saturnalia is that there was a princeps of Saturnalia, which they call it king of Saturnalia, but shouldn't it be prince of Saturnalia? Because they could have said Rex Saturnalia. They didn't say Rex. They said
Yeah.
princ. Anyways, the
Yeah.
princeps of Saturnalia is chosen to be this mock king for the week or whatever. So people are like, well, that's very specific. And the pushback that I hear people get, and it's a good point, is that the geography doesn't make up. Why don't we find this in Italy? Why are we finding this all the way in England? But I did find some evidence that suggests that Saturnalia was happening all the way in England based on this papyri that was found.
Oh yes, the Vindolanda tablets, right? These are these wood tablets with records on them, which many of them date from the end of the first, beginning of the second century, and they are sort of remnants of a Roman fort, which was just south of what later became Hadrian's Wall. And it's a pretty sensational archaeological find because we have so many of these wooden tablets, which just contain slices of life being like being part of the Roman occupational force in northern England. Yeah, and one of those mentioned Saturnalia. That's absolutely true. It's not very surprising, right? Why would maybe an Italian officer who serves in the Roman army not celebrate Saturnalia far away from home?
Right. That's what I was saying. I think it's just. Oh, and then there's also a passage in the Talmud in the Mishnah that compares Hanukkah to Saturnalia, where the author basically says ours is 8 days after the solstice. Theirs is 8 days before, even though it's not 8 days. I don't know why he says that, but that suggests that if he knows about this and he's writing this in like I don't know somewhere in the east, maybe Jerusalem or Babylon or something, wherever they wrote that, that suggests that Saturnalia is probably happening in other cities other than Rome.
Yeah,
But but I think
plausible. Yeah.
I think what you're saying makes more sense. That the calends is what really brings these traditions widespread because of the secular nature of them. That would be make a lot. That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, there's also just more evidence of the spread of the calends in at the tail end of antiquity going into the early Middle Ages, right? We have lots of evidence from Gaul, right? And that's already adjacent geographically to Britain, and you can make a case that maybe it's through France that these traditions ended up being part of English culture. Whereas with Saturnalia, again, of course, it's pretty obvious that it must have been celebrated across the Mediterranean at least. But when it comes to Northern Europe, we just don't have that much evidence. Even though that Vindolanda tablet is very interesting, absolutely.
Yeah, the other thing that I noticed too is Christopher Mytilene in the 11th century mentions Brumalia, and it sort of sounds like there's some remnants of not just like I was going to say Saturnalia, but I don't think it's Saturnalia at that point. I think it's just the festive season in general again, the Kalends on one end, Saturnalia on the other, and these sort of rituals and these traditions just sort of continue and sort of mold into something different. Him mentioning this all the way in the 11th century, I think, indicates that they're still doing these yearly festivities.
Yeah. The Brumalia are not as well attested as the Kalends, but they're definitely mentioned. This might be just my ignorance. I think these are mostly attested in the Greek-speaking sort of Byzantine cultural sphere, and there's not
Yeah.
much Brumalia mentioned in Latin sources. I could be completely wrong about that. But it's another good point that we have a season that exists independently of any particular religion or religious background.
Yeah, that's a good point because when they talk about Brumalia as this sort of feast festival thing, you're right. It's only in the Byzantine East. When it's mentioned in older sources, I think Pliny the Elder talks about it. Doesn't seem to be that. It just seems to be a calendar thing, like the Bruma or the Brumalia, midwinter. It just means midwinter. So I think
I
that's a
think
good
that's
point.
right.
I didn't even think about that until you just pointed it out. It seems to be a difference in how they what even is Brumalia, you know?
I don't really know, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's one of those words that comes up in sources, and you wonder what goes on at Brumalia.
Right, exactly. Because then, like I said, in the older Latin West sources, they're just like, yeah, the Brumalia, the midwinter. They don't say anything. And then Christopher Mytilene later on in the Byzantine East is like the Brumalia festival. They're having all this fun. So I think, but what I think that tells me, and I could be wrong, I think it tells me that there is, like I said, these rituals and festivities are sort of morphing into a more secular, Christian friendly thing that people can all get together and do. Yeah. So
Absolutely, yeah.
I wanted to go back to the dates now. We mentioned January 6th. January 6th seems to be the oldest tradition, in my opinion, from what I'm gathering, based on Christ being born in the wintertime. Do you think that that plays a role in the calculations of trying to get cosmic, uh, these cosmic births and deaths? Do you think there's some role that January 6th plays in that?
There is one theory out there which I don't subscribe to necessarily, but it's worth mentioning because it falls into the wheelhouse of calculation theories, and it's the idea that there is sort of a switch from the Hebrew calendar or to the Julian calendar in the sense that they think about again the creation of the world. Of course, man was created on the sixth day of creation, and if you think about this very schematically, the first day of the year according to the Hebrew Jewish calendar is Nisan. That creation is on the 6th of Nisan. And then you just switch from there to the first day of the Julian calendar, and you get the 6th of January. I mean, that has been proposed. I think it's a bit too neat, to be honest. Um, to be honest, I don't really know why January 6th arises. What it certainly points to is that there's a long-standing commitment to the idea that Christ must have been born in winter rather than any other time of the year. What I argued in this article that I published many years ago is that maybe biblical exegesis played at least a supplementary role in this way of thinking. There's a certain way in which you can extract the winter birth from the Gospel of Luke if you falsely assume that the father of John the Baptist was the Jewish high priest. And some early Christian or fourth century exegetes seem to be making that assumption. But maybe there are even deeper reasons for believing that it must be a winter birth. Solar symbolism might give you the answer, but it might also be some impulses from other religious practices that lead to that assumption. To be honest, I'm a bit I'm a bit ignorant why exactly Epiphany came to end up on the 6th of January. I think that's an unsolved problem to a large extent.
And there's also the possibility that because the Basilides is an interesting character. If we talk about him, we don't know, we don't really have his writings. We have what people say about him. The way they describe this guy is he's basically the type of Christian that you find in the Greek magical papyri, the sort of all over the place, Abraxas, the Magus Archon, that type of Christianity. That indicates to me that if Basilides would have been more likely to assimilate practices that were happening in Alexandria that were already going on sort of Christianizing them, sort of like what we get with the Nicene preacher, the 2nd century Christian, who's just like, Christ is the fulfillment of the Eleusinian mysteries, the Phrygian mysteries, all these mysteries. That's Christ. It's really just Christ. Sort of like a way more extreme version of what you get with Eusebius's preparation for the gospel, where he's basically saying everything's pointing to Christ, not just the Old Testament, but all this stuff is pointing to Christ. The Nicene preacher seemed to be doing that way more extreme, basically saying, yeah, go ahead, attend the Phrygian mysteries. You'll see the mysteries of Christ in there. Basilides, I think, is a little bit like that, and I wouldn't be surprised if his epiphany. And by the way, I should point this out, that Clement, when he talks about Basilidians celebrating the baptism, they don't say anything about a birth. It's just the baptism.
Yep.
However, John, from what Hippolytus tells us, the central gospel to Basilides was John's gospel. John's gospel doesn't have a birth scene. So we presuppose that these Christians all had 4 gospels unified early on. They didn't. If Basilides only had John's gospel, then why would he celebrate a birth? He would celebrate the coming of the coming of the Lord in the baptism. So I'm doing speculation here. I get that, but it seems likely to me that Basilides' baptism is the Epiphany. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean that's a very fair assumption to make, and of course, even when Epiphany becomes more of a nativity festival, the baptism seems to be part of the theme in most places where Epiphany is celebrated. They're sort of wrapped into one, right? It's sort of birth and baptism at the same time, because it's all about God manifesting in the real world. What of course is that's what of course Epiphany means essentially. And so the baptism is an important part, especially in Eastern Christian circles. But there is such a disconcerting chronological gap between the Basilidians, according to Clement of Alexandria, and the first solid attestations of Epiphany as an ecclesiastical feast, which takes us to the 4th century. There's also this contradiction, or not a contradiction, but there are 2 dates that are attached to the Basilidian baptism.
January 11th. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I think Clement mentions the later date first, and then, and some say it's the 6th of January. It's just hard to know. It's just hard to know what to make of that. There's an article by Förster, which came out, I think, in 2008, where he says the Basilidians have nothing to do with the history of Epiphany. That's just sort of a parallel development. I don't know if that's true either. It's just one of those problems that our sources lay at our doorstep, and we don't know what to do with it, really. Yeah.
That's a fair point, that it's first of all, you're right. Clement gives us 2 dates, which is weird, and he gives us the 11th first. I've also heard some people say that's interesting because the Theodosia of Dionysus, which is an epiphany, and has a wine miracle tied to it, that was a week-long festival that started on the night of January 5th to the 11th. So they go, maybe that's where the confusion is with Clement, and that's speculative. That's very speculative. We just can't know that for sure. But it is a fair point. Like, we don't know. It could be a coincidence that the Epiphany comes on January 6th, and it just happens to be that Clement also said that Basilides had these dates. That could be a coincidence. I think people should know that nuance there.
A lot of this stuff is just tantalizing.
Yeah, it is.
And then you always, right? And unless we are dealing with papyri or inscriptions, we're dealing with texts that are transmitted in manuscripts from the Central or later Middle Ages in many cases, especially when it's Greek manuscripts, right? I mean, a 10th century Greek manuscript is relatively early given what we often have to work with. And there's so many occasions for shenanigans and interpolations along the way, during all those centuries for which we don't have any manuscripts. Which makes everything even more worrying, unfortunately.
I mean, I think it's more likely that, like, if we assume that Basilides' Epiphany was on January 6th, and that's like what you just pointed out, we have to assume that first. If that's true, it's probably more likely that if there's any pagan influence on Christian dates, it's that one rather than the December 25th one. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly much more open to that possibility when it comes to January 6th. Um, the problem is that for January 6th, we don't have these kind of texts that tell us something about calendrical calculations and speculations that are a bit more independent of like interreligious transfers. With December, even with December 25th, I'm kind of on the fence. But it's just important to point out that we can go back to the early third centuries, third century when it comes to sources that might point to,
Calculate.
independent speculations as the origin of December 25th.
What is the old? So, in your opinion, what is the first one? Is it Julius Africanus? What's the first, and what's the date of it that we can say probably there probably was a calculation here?
I mean, the first one that's solid, in my view, is the statue of Hippolytus, where you can really say, here we have somebody calculating, or the product of their attempt. And with Julius Africanus, it's a very fair argument, or it's a very fair hypothesis to say that he was also in the business of doing some calculation and making sure that his resurrection date is astronomically plausible. That's something we can infer from the surviving fragments. And fragment here means not papyrus fragments, but quotations in later sources. And I mean, his chronicle dates from around 221, right? That's almost
Yeah.
the same time as Hippolytus. So these are our earliest examples for that calendrical speculation being implemented to get a neat chronological system where you can assign a death date to Jesus and maybe even a conception and birth date. But the December 25th date is not explicitly mentioned in any of these sources, unless, of course, Tom Schmidt is right that the chronicle that's attributed to Hippolytus really does point to December 25th, which is not a bad argument. Again, it's not mentioned explicitly, but if somebody says, well, the world was created on March 25th, and then there are so and so many years plus 9 months to the birth of Jesus, if that's really how you're supposed to read that passage, then it's implicit, right?
Yeah. Can you let's explain that before we close out? Is that this idea that prophets were born on their day they died? I've only seen one example, Moses. Is there any other?
If I remember correctly, Isaac has that attributed to him in one Second Temple Jewish source, but I don't have that information with me right now. There are very few sources to actually mention that idea explicitly, but
So this wasn't like a popular, because I've heard people say this. This was a popular thing in the third century from Roman historians that when a famous person died, they just assumed that they born on that day.
With a convention that was in circulation around that time among historians, who usually identified the dates of important historical figures' deaths with the dates of their births.
I think that's taking it too far. The reason why I accept these parallelisms is simply because that's what you have in these early sources I just mentioned, like Africanus and Hippolytus. They obviously want to parallelize creation of the world, either conception and birth, and death and resurrection, all taking place at least roughly at the same time of the year. This is just something they obviously do. Whether they rely on some, ancient Jewish view of the lifespans of the patriarchs, I think to me is very secondary.
I agree with that because they don't seem to be the Christians early on are not like trying to copy Jewish people and things. They're trying to do it seems like it's not a thing they do really. Um, but even if we do, let's go with it. Let's roll with it. All right, they're copying this tradition, this Moses and Isaac tradition. The problem with that is they're not doing it right. They're doing because Moses is born on the day he died, not conceived on the day he died. So do we have is this sort of an early apologetic maybe of how they can how they can justify doing this 9-month thing?
Yeah, I think they want to parallelize something, and for some reason, there's a commitment to the idea that the birth wasn't in spring; it was in around the time of the winter solstice, and so the obvious alternative is to parallelize death, creation of the world, and conception. For a long time, there was a resistance to that because instinctively, a lot of scholars read the word Genesis or Genesis in Greek as meaning birth, but that's totally not obvious. And Tom Schmidt, thankfully, did the right thing and went through the corpus of Greek literature and showed there's plenty of examples where Genesis means conception, especially around that time, around the year 200. And he made it very plausible that they were actually often referring to the conception of Christ when they said Genesis. Again, so the conception gets parallelized with these other two events, the creation of the world and the death of Christ, presumably because the idea that Christ was born in winter was very appealing. I think
Yes.
it might just be be pushed back to solar symbolism, cosmological, schematic ideas of Christ's role in the world. Maybe just, there's something appealing to the idea that a solar deity is born at the winter solstice when the days are shortest. There's something appealing about that idea if you're thinking in these terms. And maybe that's part of the equation. But again, like I argue in one of my articles, maybe there's some exegesis going on as well. It's really hard to figure out.
And it seems to be a common fad at the time in the multiple cults that the birth of the divine child is in the wintertime. And so what this all tells me, from what I'm gathering from reading you and Schmidt and others, is they wanted to get there somehow to the birthday in the wintertime. So how they got there doesn't necessarily matter. It just they wanted to get there, it seems like.
Yeah, I think there is something to that. But what I have been arguing and what I think is important, this discovery that if you do your calculations and you can actually, if you do it, you can actually show that the crucifixion happened on March 25th. I think that was a very neat finding. And similarly, Afrikaners found that the resurrection happened on March 25th. That March 25th kind of helps you fine tune your birth date implicitly, right? You can always say, okay, it was around the time of the winter solstice or in midwinter. But if you have that date and then you go forward 9 months, right, you get exactly to December 25th. So I think there's sort of a systematic relationship between these two dates that play a role in convincing people that we're going with December 25th, not any other date.
Yeah, and well, I also wanted to ask you another thing too, is the calculation of March 25th. Isn't it true that it's not necessarily true that any of the Passovers that happen between 29 and 33, I think, actually do occur on that date, if I'm not mistaken? Or do they?
Yes, I think that's right. I think the next one that is historically plausible is in 36. Well, there's one in 33, but that's not a March date. That would take you to the 3rd of April.
Right.
And then in 36, the plausible date would be the 30th of March.
Well, and that's what I want. The reason why I wanted to point this out right now is because that kind of, and I could be wrong. I would like to get your thoughts on this. You might know this more than I am, obviously. Doesn't that indicate that they weren't really trying to calculate? They were trying to. Did they try and get it wrong, or are they not really calculating? Because isn't it not that hard to calculate that back? Or is it very hard?
What I would say is this: if you look at this Hippolytus Passover full moon table, it is correctly calibrated for its starting year. So the table starts in 222 and it puts the full moon where it's supposed to be astronomically. And then it goes off the rails very quickly because the calendrical cycle is astronomically very imprecise. But if you just ignore that and you use that cycle to calculate backwards, it's in a way correctly implemented.
Really?
So when this Hippolytus person says, well, it's in 29 that we find the correct combination of data, he's not lying, right? He's just following the logic of this table. And that's why I say, in this sense, it's a calculation that has sort of some internal consistency to it. The fact that from our vantage point, this is not the correct date or cannot be the correct date possibly is besides the point, right?
What's the difference between our calculations now and what was he getting wrong? Is there something major that he's getting wrong?
Yeah, there's just this very simplistic assumptions that the date of the full moon will reappear in the Julian calendar after 8 years. It really doesn't, right? It's much more complicated than that. Even a 19-year cycle, which is considerably better, will still be off by a certain number of hours after 19 years. But this 8-year cycle, the way it's implemented in this Easter table, is off by 1.5 days after each iteration. It's a huge error that just compounds and compounds and compounds.
Oh, so he did actually try to calculate.
Yeah, I mean the result follows logically from the way the table is set up. That's all I can say. And in this sense, there's no obvious skullduggery going on here. Of course, motivated reasoning can be involved, but if somebody approaches this table naively and says, "Garn Dolly, I want to see when Jesus died," they would get this result.
That's a big deal. I didn't know that. I was wondering how if he tried the calculation, shouldn't he have gotten there? But I didn't think about that. That's interesting. He's doing it by moons. Um,
Yeah,
is there
it's just
what calculations would we do today? If we're living in 222 and what would you do different than him?
well, we would just use our modern, orbital elements for the moon and the sun to figure out when the conjunction and the opposition of the moon happened in a particular year. And then, of course, there's always this ambiguity. How would the Jews in the first century have actually counted the days of the moon? You have a couple of options here. Sometimes it can be a day off, but basically that's what we do. We just use the latest astronomical data, and then we can try to use even more complicated data to figure out when the moon would have been visible from a particular point. That's one of the most complicated problems to solve, actually, in astronomy relating to lunar calculations, or relating to historical chronology at least. You can do that with a certain degree of reliability. This can always be kind of obviated by atmospheric conditions that we cannot predict, right? Maybe the sky was very cloudy on the 3rd of April 33, and that sort of throws you off because people didn't see the moon, so they start the lunar month one day later. These are kind of problems you cannot solve, but otherwise we have a very good idea of when exactly the conjunction of the moon happened and when the moon became visible for any date in history, really. And you just look for a year in which that Passover full moon would have coincided with a Friday. And the options that we have now from our modern sort of vantage point is the 7th of April 30, the 3rd of April 33, and maybe the 30th of March 36. So the scholars are kind of split between those options, and it's all a matter of when you think Jesus was born, and you try to figure out at which point did he probably die.
What's the other calculation that he makes that gets us to April 2nd? What's up with that? I know Schmidt talks about this.
It's very straightforward. He just goes back another 30 years from the crucifixion. Again, assuming there's a perfect parallelism. So if he died on Passover, his life, whether it's conception or birth, also began on Passover, and it's just 30 years before. It's a very schematic thing. The 30 years are, of course, mentioned in Luke chapter 3, I think in 3:23, where it says Jesus was about 30 years when he was baptized. Again, there's some logical flaw here, because if you read the Gospels together, obviously there should have been a couple of years between the baptism and the crucifixion. They didn't just get baptized and then get killed a couple of weeks later, right?
That's probably why the Epiphany got to, because they're like, oh, he's on his birthday getting baptized. We already have a baptism Epiphany. Boom, boom, boom. But the April 2nd thing. So you're saying that in that particular case, he does follow the Moses tradition. It's not a conception. He's born on that day.
Well, I don't know. What he says is the genesis of Christ. And of course, that word is also used in Matthew chapter 1, verse 18, where it says, so here's the story of the genesis of Christ. And then you have the whole story of how the angel appears to Joseph and tells him that he's going to have a son. And then afterwards, he gets betrothed to Mary, and then she conceives, and then he marries her. So depending on how you read it, this could even in the Gospel of Matthew, this might actually mean conception. It's not obvious. But whoever put this annotation on the Easter table or the Passover table just uses genesis of Christ, and we are left to guess what that actually means. I think conception is more likely, but hard to say.
So let me get this straight. We have 3 possible dates from Hippolytus. One of them is really dubious, the commentary on Daniel 1, but that one's very straightforward. Then you have a April 2nd date, that's in the 220s, and then another calculation in 220s about the December 25th. There's 3 total for him.
So the Easter table, which is, like you said, from the 220s, only has the 2nd of April. And then there is the Chronicle, which is a bit later, 235 roughly, but very closely connected with the content of this Easter table. The Chronicle has this passage where Schmidt quite reasonably says, if you read this literally and if you do some, make a few tweaks here and there, then it's implicit that the birth of Jesus happened a certain number of years plus 9 months after March 25th. The problem with this chronicle is that we don't have it in full in its original Greek. So the interpretation of this passage relies on two Latin translations, essentially, which are, I think, no earlier than the 4th century. And once again, we have late manuscripts, there are textual problems. In this case, one of the problems is that it uses the word generatio twice, and it's unlikely that it means the same thing in both contexts. Sometimes this happens, right? Things get translated in a misleading way. What Schmidt argues that in one case, the word that was translated means conception, and in the other case, it means birth. There are two different Greek words behind this repeated use of the word generatio. These are some of the assumptions you must make in order to make the argument work as a whole. But Schmidt could well be right that December 25th is implicit in this chronicle. Once again, one has to be very careful. I'm not fully endorsing this, but it's certainly worth taking notes of. And Schmidt did a very, very, very impressive job teasing this out.
So you have Hippolytus, and again, it's messy. It's not straightforward. It's based on a few speculations that you have to make. Then with Julius Africanus, that's the other one. Is that one just as messy?
It's not as messy. The only problem is that we don't have the text anymore. We have those fragments, and those fragments, they cohere pretty reasonably well. So what we know for a fact, almost at least, is that every year in this chronicle began on March 25th. The resurrection was on that date. The beginning of the world, at least the 4th day of creation, when the sun and the moon are made, which is really the beginning of time in a sense, that is on March 25th. And then he counts exactly five and a half millennia, 5,500 years between the creation of the world and the sarkosis of Christ, which means the becoming flesh of Christ. Could mean conception, right? Which in that case would plausibly be on March 25th. There is no surviving passage that's definitely by Julius Africanus where he says, well, Christ was born on December 25th. However, there are much later chronicles, Byzantine chronicles. There's one by George Syncellus, from around the year 800. I forgot when exactly it was written, I think early 9th century, where he obviously relies on Julius Africanus a lot, and he has precisely the chronological system that you would expect. So he has those dates down, conception on March 25th and December 25th. It would be, too bold to say he's got this from Africanus, unfortunately, because there's just too many centuries in between. But it's possible that Africanus is actually the originator of this entire set of dates that becomes so influential both in the West and in the East. Who knows? Wow. It's just so hard. We're so plagued with difficult transmission cases.
So those are the two cases where we have calculations being made. Is there any more in the 3rd century?
Yeah, there's a text that's actually very similar to this Hippolytus inscription conceptually, which is from the year 243. This is a text that's known as De Pascha Computus. It was written in North Africa. It used to be attributed to Saint Cyprian, but it's not by him. And this text is structurally very similar to this Easter and Passover table that we find on this Hippolytus statue. It just arrives at a different set of dates, partly because he has to reset the entire cycle, because as I mentioned earlier, it just goes off the rails real quick because of these imperfections, these astronomical imperfections. So in his chronological system, Christ dies, I think, on the 9th of April in 31. I could be wrong. It's been a while since I looked at the text. And his birth date, again, he goes back like 30 or 31 years to a Passover that falls on the 28th of March. And according to him, that's also the date of the creation. And the 28th of March is the day when the sun was created and when Jesus was born, because Christ is the Son of righteousness. So you have this very explicit solar imagery enshrined in the text. He, of course, refers to March 25th as the Nativitas of Christ. So in this case, it's not the conception, at least not literally. It's always possible that he gets this idea from a Greek text that uses Genesis, and he interprets this as meaning birth, even though the original author intended something else. Again, this is one of our problems, just the ambiguity of the word Genesis, which literally just means becoming or beginning.
But if that's March 28th, wouldn't that be December 28th?
Well, according to him, the birth is on March 28th. So, I mean, this text does not endorse a winter birth.
Oh, okay, that's what you're getting at. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So there's two December 25th ones, and then there's another one for March 28th.
Yes, two potential December 25th one, and one March 28th.
And that's another thing. No, people stop saying potential. And I'm not, I've noticed because of how much people hate mythicists, which is fair. Mythicists are kind of annoying, but because of how much people hate mythicists, they overcompensate and say this is a fact. Christians were like, it almost makes it seem like Christmas was a celebration already. And it's like, hold your horses. We just have a few private calculations, 2 of them possibly. And it wasn't really, it's not like they had emails and DMs back then. Like Hippolytus didn't just calculate this and go, all right, press a button. Now every Christian in the empire now thinks that December 25th Christ was born. It takes decades for these things to really spread out and become.
Oh, yeah. No, I agree entirely. I mean, the one thing I want to push back against, and that's really the main reason I wrote my articles, first of all, the idea that these calculations make no sense or abstruse, which some people have argued. I oppose that because you can make sense out of them very easily. The other point is, even if this whole Sol Invictus influence thesis is correct, it's not a matter of the church just saying, oh, they have this December 25th festival, let's put our birth date on the same day, and that's the only reason. There's obviously some speculation going on since the early 3rd century, and March 25th is an established date within this realm of speculation since the early 3rd century. This is just a fact, and it needs to be taken into account. You cannot just put this aside when you think about the origins of Christmas. So that's sort of my minimalist stance on all of this.
I couldn't agree more. And who else? Another person who agrees with you on this is Andrew from Religion for Breakfast. I've talked to him about this, and he thinks that there's probably some sort of hybrid theory that makes the most sense for this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so some intermediary, some middle ground position.
Yeah,
sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly open to that. I'm mostly just kind of bummed out by the sort of nature of our sources. There's just so much uncertainty wherever you look.
Yeah, I wish there was more explicit sources, but I think you're right. I think people who just sort of ignore these calculations or just say it's all copying paganism, that seems a little bit too much. That's sort of nonsensical. But then again, at the same time, I think, like I mentioned earlier in the video, there is no religion called paganism. There's just people in their cults, and there's trends, and trends start to develop, and everyone starts to follow certain trends. It's not like there's two religions, paganism versus Christianity, and they're like sitting there opposing each other the whole time. It's just like how culture is today. Star Wars adopted from Dune, but there's no scene in Star Wars where there's a plagiarism happening where it's copying Dune word for word, but there's like some tropes that you could find and you go, oh, this looks a lot like Dune. So I think the same thing exists for the ancient world.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna disagree.
So I think a hybrid theory makes the most sense for this.
Yeah. Obviously interreligious influence is not something you can discount very easily.
Sure.
So when I'm called a proponent of the calculation theory, I don't want to be misunderstood as somebody who completely dismisses that. Right. Far from it. Would be unreasonable.
I've noticed that from you very, very quickly, that you're very nuanced about this. You're trying, and again, this is a sign of a great scholar, where it doesn't seem like there's any agenda at all. It's just, where does the data fall? That's it. That's all I care about. It's very hard to. I admit myself, I'm biased. I'm looking for pagan parallels. I admit it. Like, I do it, but I also have ways to check my biases. It's very hard to just be completely unbiased and just go with exactly how the data falls. We all have our biases.
Sure. Yeah. 100%. Yeah. I mean, sometimes as a scholar, you're simply driven by the necessity to publish something that's new and that fill the niche somewhere in the sort of tapestry of existing scholarship, right? And that biases you. Just the need to say something different.
Just to be
it's not ideological, but it's still a bias, right?
Yeah, you're right. That's very true. Our system's sort of designed that to even be a PhD, you have to come up with something new. So it sort of incentivizes that. But
Mhm.
that's where peer review comes in. So we kind of have checks. Exactly. There's always checks on biases. That's how it works. Is there
Hopefully.
anything that we missed that you think is substantial? We've covered a lot of ground in just this 1 hour. What do you anything on that?
I'm pretty happy with what we covered. I'm glad we got to talk about the calends. I think people are sleeping on the calends. They're super important in explaining sort of the long-term history of the festive season and how it sort of got preserved between antiquity and more recent times. And I'm glad we talked about that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point because the calends is one of the things that's not talked about a lot, but you have the similar Christmas season traditions happening with the calends. It's also more likely to be adopted because of the secular nature of it.
Yeah,
So
I agree.
well said. I have links in the description for your articles and any projects coming out that you want to talk about. Anything coming out?
Not relating to a late antique religion, unfortunately. I mean, I could bore you. I could bore the socks of you talking about medieval astronomy, but that's probably not the right
Oh,
audience.
I would love that stuff. But is there a book coming out about that?
It's in the works. It's going to be about Central Medieval Latin astronomy, and it's going to be for nerds, essentially.
Yeah, I'm working on a project that's in the works on the Dark Ages topic of is it like the term Dark Ages, where it comes from. Obviously, there's a lot about Petrarch. Petrarch is a big part of my video. I would love to ask you about that at a different point if we can maybe schedule something left, but we could talk about that off this. But yeah, this has been great. I appreciate your time.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and Dark Ages is a fascinating topic, absolutely. And I've been working a lot on the early Middle Ages recently, so I've got ideas.
Oh, great. I can't wait to talk to you about that. And so stay tuned for that. And you have just attained true gnosis.
Happy Saturnalia.
Happy Saturnalia. Yo, Saturnalia.